Our lesson with our last verse of the lesson, Isaiah chapter 5 is where we'll begin. I've been thinking for the last couple of weeks about how our world often depicts God, the way and the terminology in which they use to describe him, and oftentimes how they compare God with human society or with our present day beliefs. Isaiah writes, 500 years before the birth of Jesus, so 2,500 years, and he describes this very problem, where we take what is good and describe it as evil, and take what is evil and describes it as good. Let's read verse 20 and following. Isaiah says, "Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness, who put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. Woe to those who are wise in their own eyes and shrewd in their own sight." And he continues on with another series of woes. Woes to those who were heroes at drinking wine and valiant men in mixing strong drink. But I want to focus really there on verse 20 and 21. Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, and those who call darkness light and light darkness, and those who are wise in their own eyes. God has often been criticized lately for being a God who is unloving or uncaring. That if his commandments are still true of what he wants, then he's a God that doesn't want very good things. And sometimes people refer to it as the hardness of God. And in contrast, we describe men as being kind, as being long-suffering, as being gentle, as compared to God. For one, we'll give a couple examples where God demands the sanctity of life. Humankind says, well, it's my body and it's my choice. And they said, well, God is uncaring about, my choice and my life and what effect this may have on me. And it's much more caring for humankind to say, no, it's your body, it's your choice. You get to decide that for yourself. Where God has very strict laws when it comes to sexuality. Our culture says, well, love really is just acceptance of whatever you choose to practice in your life. And God must be very unloving, or he doesn't care about these particular people because he has laws against their actions. And the world says, well, we just are more accepting and more loving than God is because we accept everybody. When it comes to the genders, God has, again, very, very set rules. He created them male and female. And yet our society says, well, we don't have the right to tell other people what they are. We're much more understanding. We're much more forgiving. We're much more gentle or soft than God is. He's too harsh in those areas. When it comes to marriage, divorce, and remarriage, you don't have to get very far into the book of Matthew before you realize that God has very strict rules on marriage, divorce, and remarriage. And yet, when it comes to the world says, marriage is there to make you happy. And if you're no longer happy in your marriage, well, then find another person that is going to make you happy. Or even family roles. When it comes to mothers and fathers, when it comes to children and parents, when it comes to husbands and wife and what the role is in the family, God has, again, really rigid rules that we call very hard commandments. And yet the world says, well, traditional roles really have no place in our modern society. We're much more flexible than God is. When it comes to church discipline, how many people maybe have you talked to that have been wronged by, in their minds, they've been wronged by a church by having church discipline acted upon them? And the concept of church discipline brings up usually negative feelings. Well, how could any church do that? Churches should be accepting. They should be allowing anything that people want to. They're just there to accommodate people to worship God in the ways that people want to worship him. Or how about the concept of hell? God speaks very definitively that there is a place of punishment. And yet the world says, well, there is no hell because that's just too hard to wrap our minds around. I had someone say to me recently that the hardness of God is softer than the softness of man. And I think that is such an apt and fitting description of the situation, that we view God's hardness as being hardness, and yet he has other reasons for it that maybe we don't understand, and maybe even for a long time. And while I would love to take the time to go through all of these and talk about historical ramifications and consequences to these teachings, we won't have the time to do all of that. So I want to look just at a couple of them. We start off with the sanctity of life. I don't know how much you guys know about Roe versus Wade. It was before I was even born. But Jane Roe, which is not her real name, falsified an account of rape. And that started the whole lawsuit. I mean, just to begin with that one concept and see what the world has taken from that one concept. As of Friday, when I did my number research, 56,993,299 abortions in the United States alone since 1973, when Roe versus Wade passed. 56,993,299 as of Friday, and there's a pro-life website that will do a counter that'll keep on counting for you. So that's 2 days old. We are a couple hundred behind already. To give you an idea of, just to wrap your mind a little bit around the numbers, in the year 2000 alone, there were more abortions than all of the soldiers that died in the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, World War I, World War II, Korean War, Vietnam War, and the Gulf Wars combined. And that's just in the year 2000. There is all kinds of secondary problems that arises in a psychological and physiological way. Women frequently suffer anxiety, guilt, pain, depression, irritability, anger, insomnia, nightmares, drug and alcohol abuse, and suicidal thoughts after going through the procedure. The world calls that kindness and love. And since 1973, in just our country, we have put our stamp of approval on almost 57 million deaths. Infanticide is a terrible thing that has long-lasting consequences to direct mental health and physical health of mothers, on the ramification of family, and the breakdown of our society as a whole. I want us to just briefly consider what Isaiah says in verse 20 again of chapter 5. Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness, and put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. Isn't that exactly where we are in our society? Where we say, well, we can't talk about the sanctity of life because, well, this book is outdated and God is just too harsh on his rules. So we will fabricate a rape charge and push through a court case through the Supreme Court to ratify something that allows 57 million murders in a little over 40 years. You know, getting the topic of marriage, divorce, and remarriage, where the world says, well, marriage is there to make you happy, and if you're not happy, well, then just move on. Find someone else who is going to make you happy. And we fail to recognize that our happiness is not the main thing inside of a marriage. In fact, if you look at the husband and the wife roles as given over in Ephesians chapter 5, it never once talks to the husband about his personal happiness. And for the wife, oddly enough, it never talks about her personal happiness. It talks about washing and sanctifying her so he can present her blameless before Christ. It talks about our roles as husbands for the wife and the wife for the husband. We completely misunderstand the roles of marriage if we view it in the sense that the world views it as our own personal happiness. We also forget that during that process, there's more than just two people who suffer. Oftentimes they say, well, if there's no kids, luckily there's no kids, because people still recognize the harsh psychological problems that keep on spiraling out from those things. But that isn't just kids, it's also parents and in-laws, extended families, all have issues moving forward. Not only that, but the examples to kids and others. And there are some things that if you experience in your life, even if you hate it, there's a tendency for that to be replicated in the next generation. It's kind of an odd thing. If someone's raised in an alcoholic household, they are still pretty likely to grow up and be alcoholics, even if they hate all that they got to see with their parents. Same thing for people who grew up in abusive households. Even if you hate being the person who is abused all of your life, if you're a woman, there's a pretty good chance you might actually find an abusive husband. Or if you are a man, there's a pretty good chance that you're going to grow up to be abusive. Not to say that it's a statistical impossibility that you can escape the cycle. I'm just saying that there is ramifications. And the same thing happens with divorce and remarriage. To share a rather personal one, I have some family members who are now deceased, who had a very hard marriage. Both of them together made a terrible pair. But they remained married until death do us part. And talking with family members, they wonder the question of why. Why would you ever put yourself through all of that for all of those years? Wouldn't it just have been better for them to separate years ago and save themselves so much hurt and pain? Just to, maybe this is just one of those secondary things that isn't directly connected to this topic, but they have 5 kids. And out of the 5 kids, none of them are divorced. And almost all of them have really good marriages. And of all the grandkids, none of the grandkids are divorced. Well, one of them is, I believe. What does that example show? What was that? Was there a purpose behind that? Does God see that and have that inside of his plan for marriage, divorce, and remarriage? Not only for your own personal happiness or the personal happiness of your spouse, but for the example that you show to your family, your children, grandchildren, the church as a whole. One person stated, and I think he's absolutely correct, that God cares more for the sanctity of marriage than for personal happiness. That as an institution, it was the very first thing that God had made, that he made the institution of marriage between man and woman in Genesis chapter 2. And he has cared nonstop for that institution, more than my personal happiness at this moment in my marriage. As one person said, the health and the well-being of our civilization is inextricably linked to the health and the stability of marriage and family. That if you want to look at crime rates, if you want to look at people having high school dropouts or education levels along with prison internment rates, all of those go hand in hand. As the less marriages or more divorces go up, all of the other things go up because the home is the building block of our society. And yet the world says, well, this is kindness for me to just allow anybody to get married to whomever they want, whenever they want, and divorce for any reason that they want, even if it seems legitimate, that God does not allow, because that's kindness and that's softness, and that is something that is better than what God has planned for them. And they say, well, God is too harsh. And yet, as these institutions break down, our society as a whole suffers. What happens whenever you start taking out the fact of hell out of churches? What does that do? If you remove church discipline, if you go over to 1 Corinthians chapter 5 and the man who has his father's wife, and you say, well, that has nothing to do with what we do today because we just want to be accepting and kind. Well, Paul tells us what the implications are there in 1 Corinthians chapter 5. A little leaven will leaven the whole lump. Or as you look at Hymenaeus and Alexander when he writes to Timothy, that their talk spreads like gangrene and it upsets the faith of whole households. And you see that. I mean, these aren't just hypothetical thought questions. These are things that you see play out time and time again in churches and where there is no church discipline. It's not a matter of if, it really is more a matter of when these things are going to come to fruition. When it comes to family roles or gender roles, like I said, we won't have the time to go through all of that, but I want us to really consider, what actually is the outcome of those things. I want to look at a few passages, and then the lesson is going to be yours. Jeremiah, since we're already back in Isaiah, go over a couple pages into Jeremiah chapter 10. I'm going to try for a moment to put Jeremiah in its historical context. How many times do you read in the Old Testament of people doing what was right in their own eyes? Or turning from God and following after foreign gods, or having their hearts taken over by foreign gods? A lot. Up until the point where God, after hundreds of years, says, I have been long-suffering enough, and it's time to cleanse his people. Which is where we are with Jeremiah's time. Jeremiah, being one of the prophets in the southern tribes, he saw the destruction of Judah in the south, and he was left behind. And Jeremiah writes here in verse 23, he says, I know, O Lord, that the way of man is not in himself. It is not in man who walks to direct his steps. And so we ask God in verse 24, correct me, O Lord, but in justice, not in your anger, lest you bring me to nothing. Jeremiah recognizes that after all of those generations of men doing what was right in their own eyes, it did not lead them to anything good in their society. It had led to problems with their poverty, not taking care of the poor, not taking care of the widow or the orphan or the stranger in their land, as we've been talking about on Tuesday nights in our Bible classes. It has led to not that God is no longer in the picture, but he is not in the picture in the way that's meaningful in any way. You have kings who are sacrificing their children to idols. You have massive problems, all generating from men doing what was right in their own eyes. So Jeremiah simply acknowledges in verse 23, I know, O Lord, that the way of man is not in himself. It's not in man who walks to direct his steps. That what we call softness for our own society, what we look at and say, well, this is what is good and right because, we've now come to the pinnacle of our existence in the 21st century, is nothing but wickedness. How about Proverbs chapter 14? Proverbs chapter 14. Solomon, a couple hundred years before Jeremiah writes, in verse 12, says that there is a way that seems right to man, but its end is the way of death. There's a lot that our world thinks seems right and just and fair, a lot of darkness that they call light. And Solomon recognized that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, and fools despise wisdom and instruction. And he recognized that there's a way that seems right to man, but its end is the way of death. Or a couple pages back into Psalm 127. Psalm 127 and verse 1. This is probably a pretty familiar psalm. Oftentimes whenever you start a study on the family, Psalm 127 is where we start, and for good reason. He says, unless the Lord builds the house, those who build it labor in vain. You have a whole world that has built a society without God in its picture over the last couple hundred years. We have removed all of his commandments and his ideas of justice. And yet we wonder, why is our nation crumbling around us? Why are there cities on fire on a regular basis? Why is there so much unrest? And Solomon here in 127 says, unless the Lord builds the house, those who labor in vain. Unless the Lord watches over a city, the watchman stays awake in vain. It is in vain that you rise up early and go late to rest, eating the bread of the anxious toil, for he gives to his beloved sleep. You know, if our families aren't founded on the principles of God, then we labor in vain to build a good family. If our churches are not built solidly on God's commands, then we labor in vain to make a worthwhile congregation. And we wonder why our society, who has completely abandoned God's precepts, is on nothing but sand, without any solid rock beneath. We're going back over to Proverbs 27. These are some of the verses we had talked about on our Wednesday night class. There in verse 6. He says, "Faithful are the wounds of a friend, and profuse are the kisses of an enemy." I think we had talked about this on Wednesday. And all of these topics, these are things that we speak out against. Things that are meant to turn somebody from their wandering and to save a soul from death. And usually the one who is condemned the most are the ones who speak out against it. And yet Solomon says here in verse 6, "Faithful are the wounds of a friend." But it's the enemy who lavishes profuse kisses on someone who is perishing and calls it healing. And that's exactly what our society does over and over and over again. Who gets the most praise? Who gets the most accolades? Who gets lifted up the most as being brave? If it isn't the ones who are doing everything against God's commands. Who are the ones who are called bigots and individuals who are called hard-hearted and unloving, but those who speak out against evil to turn back a sinner from his wandering. If you go over to James chapter 5, this is the point that James makes. In James chapter 5, the last two verses in his book, verse 19 and verse 20. He says, "My brothers, if anyone among you wanders from the truth, and someone brings him back, let him know that whoever brings back a sinner from his wanderings will save a soul from death and cover a multitude of sins." The world calls that harshness, to attempt to turn someone back from their wandering. And God says you save a soul from death and you cover a multitude of sins. That is kindness. That is love as is defined by God. So I repeat to you the same phrase that I heard recently, that the hardness of God is still softer than the softness of men. What the world calls kindness and love and acceptance is only belittling the true nature that is hidden there. Ways that will lead people further and further down the path of sin and eventually condemn their souls to hell. So we started with one passage in Isaiah chapter 5, and I want us to read that again and to keep this passage kind of in the forefront of our minds as you watch the news, read social media, as you wonder what in the world's happening in the world around us, and recognize that God, through the Holy Spirit, wrote this for us 2,400 years ago. Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness, who put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. Woe to those who are wise in their own eyes and shrewd in their own sight. The world has a story to tell you. And that God is overly harsh, he is unloving, he is uncaring, that he is unjust, and that his words are outdated and possibly even untrue. And the other side of the coin that they're going to sell you is that they are the ones who are loving and accepting and kind and gentle and long-suffering with you. They will accept you for who you are. But the whole time that they lavish kisses on you, they only prove themselves to be your enemy. They call good evil and evil good. They take the darknesses around them and they call it light. And anytime a light shines on them, they call it darkness. They take all the bitter words that they have and call it sweet to you, and take all the sweet words from God and call it bitter to you. And yet, if we take some time, just a little bit of time, and think through it logically and see what the consequences of their actions are, it becomes readily apparent the virtue and the wisdom that God distills in his scripture. Take some time this week and to really consider Isaiah chapter 5, verse 20 and 21. Ask yourself if you have been guilty of calling good evil and evil good. And take some time to recognize how the world is doing that all the time around you. If you guys will, open your songbooks to the Song of Invitation, number 620.